Welcome to the screencast for Meditations on First Philosophy by Descartes, the second meditation. This you can find on page 173 in your textbook. So we looked at the first meditation earlier in the semester, and now we're going to move on to the second meditation. And like in a lot of the modules that we do, we stick to contemporary philosophers for a little while, and then when we get the basic sense of the problems that we're studying, we go back and take a look at the historical roots of those modern or contemporary problems. So as a quick review to the first meditation, we want to think about what Descartes' goal was and how he got to the place where he was doubting all of his knowledge. He began by realizing that since he's wrong about his beliefs sometimes, and he has no method of sorting through every single belief he has to find the good ones and the bad ones, the true ones and the false ones, he has to doubt all of them. So how do we figure out which ones are which? Which ones are true and which ones are false? He looks at the senses first and how they're prone to error, depending on differing conditions in lighting and visibility and psychological states. So if the senses are fallible sometimes, we never know if they're giving us an accurate picture of the world, and we can always doubt them. Next, he talks about dream states and how it seems like we can tell if we're dreaming or if we're awake, but it's possible that our entire lives have been a dream with just two separate states inside of it. It's also possible that we've been quote-unquote madmen our whole lives. But even in dreams, some things are still true. We still live in space and in time, and basic logical and mathematical propositions are still true. So we can't violate the law of non-contradiction. Something can't be true and not true at the same time. We can't imagine anything outside of space and time. So logical truths seem to be a good candidate for certainty, for always being true. But then we think about God, and since God is all-powerful, God could deceive us at all times about even these fundamental logical and mathematical truths. But God is all good, so then Descartes proposes the evil demon, who's not omnipotent, so is not all-powerful, but powerful enough to deceive us. And that means we could be in the Matrix, we could be brains in jars somewhere, and we would never be able to know it. We'd never be able to get outside of our own sensory and cognitive processes to see the way the world really is. So we're in a really tough spot where we don't know that we can know anything, that we can get any knowledge whatsoever. And that's where the first meditation ended. So now we move on to Descartes' solution. And it's the famous, maybe the most famous phrase in all of Western philosophy, I think, therefore I am. In our book, for some reason, it's translated as I am, I exist. Maybe that's a more faithful translation, but of course we know that it's not the most famous one. And the point of this sentence is that every time you're thinking, you know that some entity exists. You don't know what dimensionality it exists in, 3D, 2D, 10D. You don't know what kind of body it truly has, but you know that some entity is thinking. And that's what it means. That's the only thing we can possibly be certain of always. We always know that it's true, that when we think, we exist. And now Descartes wants to take that foundation, that solid, certain foundation, and build up all of the rest of human knowledge from it. But before he can do that, he's a little worried that he doesn't know anything about this thinking entity that he calls himself, or his I, his ego, if you want to have different synonyms for it. They all mean the same thing. Whatever it is that makes up this thinking entity. So we can't know that this thinking entity is a mammal. We don't know that we're alive. We don't know that we have bodies. We have to look for things that only exist in the mental realm. And he takes a step back here to try and ease your way in the second meditation, realizing that the common sense opinion is that bodies are the certain things. You can hold them, feel them, taste, smell, touch them. They're solid. And while mind or soul is abstract and tenuous and hard to explain, and that he knows that his meditations have flipped this around and that can be hard to swallow. And that's one of the reasons that it makes it really difficult to pinpoint what belongs to mind alone. I have this picture here of categorizing things. I'm not sure why I put it on this slide. It should probably be on a slide or two in the future, so we'll have to come back to it. But for now, you can see that in the picture there are examples of a lot of different regular everyday objects that somehow we classify under one umbrella. So in the top row, those are all apples, and they all look different, but somehow something in our head tells us that they belong to the same category. And that's going to be really crucial to Descartes. Descartes' eventual conclusion of what belongs to the mind alone, our powers of categorization. So these are other things that the mind can't be if we're still doubting everything that can be doubted. So all that other stuff, the senses, the logic, the mathematics, we're still not sure that that's going to give us good knowledge. So it cannot be part of whatever this self-entity is. So it can't be sense perception, because that belongs to objects in space. It can't really be imagination, because your imagination can only work with things that come from the outside world. So we haven't gotten really close to a description of what mind is, or what this thinking entity is. On page 192, I don't know if that's correct. That's actually incorrect, because that's from a prior edition of the book. So if you do happen to have the 5th edition, it is on page 192. Let me see where it is in ours. Okay. It's at the bottom of page 175. And he says, but what am I? I'm a thing that thinks. What is that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, is willing, is unwilling, and also has the capacities of imagination and sensory perceptions. So he's not talking about the sensory perceptions or the what you imagine itself. He's talking about the actual faculty inside of the mind that can do these things. So these are all the organizational systems in the mind that belong to mind alone. They might need input from experience, but there's some system inside the mind that does this categorization, this affirming things, this denying things, this willing and unwilling. They're operations of the mind themselves. So you don't have to understand the chart in the bottom left, but this is a more modern understanding of what our brains do when they categorize things. The actual processes that we use to integrate information that we get from the outside world. So these are the operations of the mind themselves, our mental powers of abstraction, or what belongs to the mind alone. And Descartes thinks that that's the solid foundation for human knowledge. Now he has an example to try and explain what these powers do. This is the wax example. He says that on the surface, bodies seem easily knowable. You can hold a book, you can smell it, you can see its solidity and its dimensions, and how long and wide it is. But its difficult to figure out the properties of the mind or soul. But he says if you take a deeper look at even the most ordinary objects, you can see that this should be flipped around, that the certain stuff comes from mind and the uncertain stuff comes from body. So he tells you to imagine you're holding a piece of beeswax. So if you've never seen beeswax before, it looks like the picture in the background here. It's a deep yellow color. It's a little bit brittle, and it often has an aroma. It's kind of a leftover of the honey that the bees had left, or the flowers that were pollinated. When you're holding it as a solid, it's hard, it's cold, has a specific color and a specific smell. Its properties seem easily understandable. But if you hold the wax to a flame, it loses its scent. It changes its shape. Its color changes, its temperature changes. So all of those physical properties are gone from the original example of the wax. They've all shifted. So how do we know it's still the same object if all of its properties have changed? It's still called wax, so it can't be the sensory properties that tell us what it is. It's the operations of the mind alone. Our understanding of cause and effect is another operation of the mind alone. And that is what's giving us knowledge that it's the same entity before and after we melted it. It's the mind that's creating the knowledge, not the outside world. And he tells us that mental understanding can be clear and distinct or imperfect and confused. So you might not be able to understand or categorize something, and then your idea of it would be imperfect and confused. But once you sit down and apply your cognitive categorization abilities to the object, your idea of the thing can become clear and distinct. So here are some conclusions. He has another short example wherein if you look outside of a window and you see people walking around in the street, you automatically conclude or infer, using the powers of your mind alone, that there are people out in the street. There's nothing in the physical scene in front of you that tells you that. You get a bunch of data of colors and shapes and distances and light, and you make a judgment using the powers of your mind to conclude that you have knowledge that are people out there. Another way to put it is the mind is what organizes data into knowledge. So in both this example and in the wax example, Descartes says we only have clear and distinct knowledge when we use our mental powers of judgment, when we classify things and mentally process what they are. And therefore the mind is clearer, truer, and more reliable than bodies can ever be. And so I want to bring you back a little bit, right to the end, to these roots of the mind-body split that we've talked about a lot. You can see it very clearly here. It's tough, but try and think about ways that Descartes might have made mistakes. We will talk about that in the future. Most contemporary scientists and philosophers don't think that mind and body are so easily separable. But we still, just like Descartes, struggle to explain the details of what a mind consists in.